welcome to the Development Management Committee. First thing I have to announce is that those present at the meeting should be aware that by law it can be recorded by anyone attending, and this means the meeting can be filmed, audio recorded, photographed or reported electronically by the use of social media. But this does not apply to any part of the meeting held in private session. Therefore, anyone present tonight should be aware that they could be recorded at this meeting, and any member of the public who does not wish to be filmed should move to an area of the meeting room away from this camera. Is anybody recording tonight? No. But as a council, we are live streaming this meeting, so you'll be able to see yourselves later. Good. Item 1.
Stephen Markovich for Councillor Terry Mitchison, and apologies from Terry Mitchison.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Item 3 then, minutes to confirm as a correct record the minutes of the meeting of the 12th of October. Do we agree with those? Thank you. Item 4, notification of urgent business. I have not been notified of any. Item 5, declarations of interest by members.
Item 6, I know the applicant.
Okay, thank you. Paul? County Council. I will declare County Council as well. Nobody else. Okay, thank you. So item 6, 22, the Avenue, Welwyn, outline planning permission for the erection of up to 12 dwellings with all matters except access reserved to include demolition of existing dwelling and industrial building.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening. This application has been called in by Councillor Cragg for being in the Greenbelt and outside the local plan. Welwyn Parish Council have also objected, citing its inappropriate development in the Greenbelt and it's previously been dismissed on appeal and not considered in the draft local plan. I would just like to clarify on page 7, paragraphs 4.6 and 4.7, both of those applications were appealed to the Secretary of State and both were dismissed. The site sits to the west of the A1M and is accessed along a driveway which slopes upwards past 3 houses. The existing dwelling is situated towards the southern boundary of the site, approximately in the middle of the plot's width. The proposal is in outline with the existing dwelling proposed for demolition alongside the existing barn that is on the site. Indicative plans have been submitted showing the potential for either 8, 10 or 12 dwellings to be provided on the site. Should planning permission be granted this evening, it will be possible and reasonable to attach a condition to restrict the maximum number of units on the site. The number determined would be based upon providing appropriate levels of amenity for future occupiers, as well as quality of life, considering its proximity to the A1M, and also to ensure adjoining occupiers are not detrimentally impacted by the development. However, you will note from the report that officers consider the proposal, even with the fewest number of units, option A, which is 8 units, would result in a development that does not reflect the character of the area, which is quite spacious with large gardens, and would appear cramped, failing to comply with national and local plan policies. However, as noted, as I've just said, the recommendation is for refusal. The site is within the Greenbelt and a detailed discussion is provided on pages 10 to 22. The proposal does not fall with any of the exceptions within the National Planning Policy Framework for appropriate development, and therefore, as you'll be aware, very special circumstances are required. As noted in paragraph 10.30, 8 very special circumstances have been advanced by the applicant, which are then discussed on the following pages. None of these are considered either individually or cumulatively to provide the very special circumstances needed to outweigh the harm to the Greenbelt. Furthermore, due to the site being adjacent to the A1M, noise and air quality are key considerations. The Environmental Health Team have assessed the proposal and considered that the noise report does not appropriately provide the necessary information to assess the level of amenity that will be provided for future residents on the site. And you'll note that no air quality state assessment has been provided, and it's therefore not possible to assess this impact. Additionally, should either the 10 or 12 dwellings be provided, which is options B or C, then a flood risk assessment as well as Section 106 planning obligations would also be required. Neither of these have been submitted, and it is therefore recommended for refusal for the 5 reasons given at the end of the report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Now we have 8 public speakers tonight, not all on this one, only one on this one. And usual rules, you get 3 minutes in which to speak. After 2.5 minutes, I will shout out half a minute, and after that last half minute goes, if the buzzer is working, it will sound, otherwise I'll tell you to sit down. So the first speaker is Chris Watts, who is the agent. I'd like to come to mid.
I want to concentrate on what could be achieved here in the context of helping the Council to respond to the significant shortfall in housing delivery to meet its objectively assessed needs that the replacement local plan inspector identified last week. He confirmed there is a shortfall of a minimum of 3,200 dwellings in the plan period and up to 4,000 if a further year's delay in the adoption of the local plan takes place. He's asked officers for a review of potential sites in the Greenbelt washed over villages to be undertaken urgently by the Council. Frankly, the Council needs every site and dwelling that can be delivered to address that shortfall, which we had already brought to the officers' attention as part of the very special circumstances we say exist. But little, if any, weight has been placed on that factor. This is completely short-sighted. It is also completely inconsistent of the Council to propose to refuse the application on Greenbelt harm grounds when the Council approved 5 dwellings only a few metres away, also in the Greenbelt, in a similar location and circumstances in recent years. Those decisions are very material in my view to this site. In addition, officers have previously confirmed in writing that this site does not fulfil any of the stated purposes of the Greenbelt and actually encouraged the applicant to pursue the allocation of the site through its Call for Sites programme, but it hasn't been recommended to be brought forward as a specific site allocation in the local plan, essentially because the Council did not want to move the boundary of the Greenbelt from the A1M motorway. The site is surrounded by 3 sides by built development and roads, with other dwellings behind Roundwood in North Herts District, making the current Greenbelt designation surely irrelevant and unsustainable. Indeed, North Herts District Council did not object on Greenbelt grounds. And on that point, I'd ask you to refer back to the site location plan that you've just been shown, which doesn't show any of the dwellings either behind Roundwood Wood or in the crest. The applicant has applied in outline for up to 12 units, but he has taken on board that the officers and a number of the neighbours have raised concerns about the scale of development. He has asked me to confirm tonight to you that he would have no objection to reducing the number of dwellings to 5 detached houses, including the retention of number 22. The description of the development on the application would allow for that reduction in number anyway, if you agreed with this, and you deferred the application tonight for a revised layout plan to be submitted. My client will, if this application is not deferred tonight, making a further outline application to that effect in the new year. He will prepare reports dealing with noise, air quality and surface water runoff. I like to think, however, that the committee is actually forward-thinking and conscious of earlier decisions it took nearby, and that if members were supportive of a revised layout for 5 dwellings, you would feel able to say so tonight, my client is here, defer a decision and give us some encouragement that you believe his site could make a valuable contribution to help the Council meet its serious shortfall in housing supply and delivery. Thank you.
Councillors? Fiona?
Thank you. I'd just like to start with a question. At the top of page 6, under the proposal at 2.1, the report states the only matter for consideration at this stage is the access. But then obviously the report goes on to consider every other aspect of the application. I just wanted to confirm if that was just an error to start with. Thank you.
Have up to 5 matters that can be reserved for later. If I can remember them all, you've got access, landscaping, layout, sorry, design and scale. and scale. Mostly applicants, when they submit, will just submit it with the access, because we need to know where the access is going to be provided, and the other elements to submit as outline would cost them a lot more money. So yes, we're looking at the access primarily, but the principle of residential development on the site, but you also needed to consider the constraints within and surrounding the site, such as the A1M and the impacts of noise, because that has to be considered at this stage in order to apply the necessary conditions that would then go forwards to a reserve matters application.
I'll continue then. Yeah, I have some concerns about this application. I take on board what Mr. Watts said and about trying to help us, meet our housing need. But again, it's about appropriate location, and I'm not convinced this is the right location. We see throughout the report concerns about noise and air pollution from the A1M, lack of information on air quality, which I think was mentioned by the Environmental Health Department. We've had over 15 letters of objection. Yes, it's in the green belt. It's not been identified in the local plan. There's concerns about flooding. Hearts Fire and Rescue are concerned it's non-compliant. So I think throughout the report, actually, there are enough concerns to make me think, actually, this isn't the right location. So I will be supporting Officer's recommendation.
I just wanted to ask officers to perhaps respond about the development of 5 adjacent properties, or 5 nearby properties, and what their kind of response to that is. If one of the critical aspects we're looking at is the scale of the development in relation to adjacent properties, whether it is in context with adjacent properties. I think that's an issue that I'd like some commentary about.
Dwellings to the south of the access road that you can see on the plan on the screen at the moment, but you can see 3, and then there's 2 just further down as well.
So there's 2 on the plan on the screen, but in the pack, the scale of one in the pack is just the top 3.
Yes, yes.
Right, okay.
How they got planning permission, I don't know, without looking at the actual application and the considerations. So it could be different circumstances. There could be existing built form there. So it was a like-for-like replacement, but without actually viewing that application, I can't comment further.
One of the keys with that, looking at that, is that the size of the plot on those 5 properties looks to be significantly larger than the area we've got here. And the area we got here we were talking about 8 properties, weren't we? So that gives us an indication in terms of density of housing within the 2 sites. So thank you very much. That helps.
It is difficult for the committee when we have outline. Don't know exactly what the site will look like when it's built out, and the density and the proximity to other properties, which makes it difficult. Although we're only going for outline at the moment, it still adds difficulty for the committee. Anyone else? Steve?
In one thing, I think I'm inclined to agree with the applicant is that it's anachronous that this is still greenbelt land, and it's the very type of patch of greenbelt that has been eroded by happenstance that now no longer fulfills any of the requirements of the greenbelt. It doesn't separate conurbations. It doesn't provide open space because nobody can get at it, etc. So, I'm looking at this and saying, well, at some stage, I'm sure, as part of the plan, we're going to look at these patches because we've got too many houses now to find, and this may be taken out of the green belt, but it's green belt now. Density, 12 is the 8 is wrong for this area. This is the avenue is an area of large individual houses with decent sized plots. Even 5 would be pushing it, but it, I think it's as it would be away from the main part of the avenue, it probably wouldn't impact on the amenity value of the avenue as an area, but it might create an unfortunate precedent for the front of the avenue. So there is concern there that that density is not appropriate in the avenue. As regards to noise, my understanding is that noise is only an issue if there are other issues with the development, and therefore that a development could not be turned down on the basis of noise alone. Otherwise, we'd never have a house built near a motorway or an airport or anywhere. So it's absurd to put too much accent on noise. It is one of the features, but it's not a vital feature. It is only if other things are inappropriate. And unfortunately, because it's Greenbelt, I can't back it. I've got to back officers, but I do support, as much as this is as useful as a letter mailed to last week, I do support the idea of trying to develop this plot to give us more than 1-for-1, as we normally insist on in the Greenbelt. I think it would be efficient use of the land without impacting too badly on the amenity area of the avenue.
Noise in itself can be a reason for refusal. It can also, what we don't have is an appropriate noise assessment to understand where the houses might be located and where appropriate mitigation might need to be provided, because you've obviously got mechanical ventilation and such like. You might try to locate the non-habitable rooms towards the A1M, but we don't have that information in order to assess. And the National Planning Policy Framework does require us to consider the amenity of occupiers as well as their quality of life, which noise can play a significant part.
Right, okay, thank you. I drove up the avenue 2 days ago, and picking up on page 8 about the road is so narrow 2 vehicles cannot pass, I can absolutely see that that is the case. Also, concerns with refuse trucks and refuse bins, which do not go up this section of the avenue. So how would that work? I don't quite understand how. I can see why a large lorry would have difficulty going up this particular avenue, the access point. Just wanted to make that. Thank you.
To the refuse bins, we have consulted client services, as you'll note on page 8. They have no objection, so I would anticipate that they might, if necessary, provide a different vehicle if it was to go up to the however many units, or the residents will be required to bring it further down. The refuse vehicle is obviously already serving a number of vehicles further up the avenue, so clearly access is provided.
Chairman, I'm following on from Steve. When you look at the Greenbelt, being a history where I used to work up and around that area, 28 to 32 were built on a nice grass verge, so the houses opposite were looking at a nice green stretch, and yet all this was built on. So I can see where Steve's coming from. If it could, as I say, in principle, I think this is a good idea, but as the officers have laid out, I'll have to go along with the officers. But when you look at the representations received, yes, 12 dwellings are too many. Where are they? Concerns about vehicle noise and noise pollution during construction. Well, as I say, over the years, it's been plenty of construction up there, and nobody's been concerned about it. The area is exclusively detached dwellings. Well, there is a mixed design of houses up there. And it's a case of, if somebody wants to live up there, then why not have a smaller house? But as I say, in principle, yes, I like the idea of houses being built, because 28 to 32 was built on a nice green patch of land up the avenue. And as far as the refuse lorries, I think there is a smaller version that goes up Oaklands. So surely this can be used, or the purchase of another one could be used. But sorry about this, but I'll have to go with officers. I just wanted to make these points, that some of the reservations are a bit pie in the sky. You know, as I say, any amount of construction causes noise, and there will be some biggish vehicles, but for the amount of time it will take to build 5, it won't put a lot of people's backs up, or shouldn't, because as it's been said before, we need these extra houses in one place or other. Okay, thanks.
We do run some small wagons for rubbish. Some of the roads around where I live have small wagons that go along, so they are available. Okay, would somebody like to make a proposal then? Is plot 6,000 adjacent to the Porsche garage at Hatfield Avenue, Hatfield Business Park. Erection of a 75-bed elderly care home development with 24 parking bays and associated landscaping.
Thank you, Chair. This application seeks full plan permission for a 75-bed care home, catering for nursing and dementia care. The site is located on the northern edge of Hatfield Business Park, situated between a Porsche dealership and the recently completed One Healthcare Hospital. To the north of the site lies Manor Road and Hatfield Garden Village beyond. The application is presented to the Development Management Committee because the Hatfield Town Council have objected to the proposal due to the height of the development, its impact on properties in Manor Road, and the lack of parking. In terms of access, the site will be accessed from the existing roundabout off Hatfield Avenue, which serves the hospital and the Porsche dealership. Whilst there'll be no pedestrian or vehicular access to Manor Road, the potential for overspill parking on adjacent residential streets remains a concern for residents. The provision of sufficient on-site parking for the proposal is therefore a key consideration. Based upon the parking standards, a care home with 75 beds would typically require 19 parking spaces. In this case, 24 spaces are proposed, which is a significant over-provision of 26%. The application is also supported by a travel plan, which seeks to encourage sustainable forms of transport. There are also financial contributions to support the implementation of the travel plan, and to meet the cost of parking surveys within the surrounding residential streets before and after the development is occupied, and if the development is shown to have an impact on parking, funding will be available to mitigate the impact. In response to comments from Councillor Duncan Bell, it is confirmed that the operator of the adjacent hospital has agreed to permit the use of their car parks in the event of visitor parking exceeding the available spaces on site. However, it's important to note that these arrangements are not permanent or binding and could potentially be withdrawn at any time. In terms of impact on neighbours, 4 objections have been received from surrounding occupiers, 2 of which from Manor Road. There have also been representations in support of the proposal from the operator of the hospital. The site layout has been designed to minimise any environmental impact on the surrounding properties. In particular, the car parking area and service areas are sited away from residential areas to the north. The distance between housing on Manor Road and the care home is between 28 and 30 metres. It is evident that design of the building has been influenced by the immediate context of the site, and a palette of materials reflects the adjacent hospital. The height of the care home is predominantly 3 stories, which is higher than the residential properties opposite, but the overall height of the building is similar or lower than the hospital. The elevations and roof are also staggered in order to break up the bulk and massing of the building. The proposal includes a comprehensive landscaping scheme which would soften the visual impact of development when viewed from Manor Road and surrounding areas. Giving consideration to the scale of the proposal, its siting and separation distance from neighbouring properties, it is considered that development would not have an unreasonable impact in terms of residential amenity of neighbouring properties and the future occupiers of the care home itself. The proposed change of use of the site from a hotel to a healthcare use is considered to be acceptable in principle, having regard to the extant outline planning permission for the site and the Hatfield Business Park Master Plan. The proposal would have an economic benefit during the construction phase, and once operational, the jobs created would comprise a variety of positions and skill sets. In design terms, the building and landscaping is considered to be of high quality. There would also be social benefits through the provision of nursing care. Consequently, it's considered that the proposal affords benefits in all areas of sustainability as defined by the MPPF. It is therefore recommended that planning permission is granted subject to the conditions and the completion of a legal agreement to secure planning obligations. Finally, to update members on late representations, further information has been received from the NHS in terms of contributions sought towards mental health and GP surgeries. Officers have considered the evidence provided in justification for the contribution in the context of the MPPF and SEAL regulations. Having done so, it is considered only the request for contributions towards mental health complies with the necessary tests. To this end, the NHS have provided details of a project at Roseanne House in Welwyn Garden City which could benefit from a contribution of £14,584.50 should members be minded to grant planning permission. The only other late representation was confirmation from One Healthcare that they support the proposal and would permit the use of their car parks as overspill. Thank you.
On this, which is Councillor James Broach, please.
Thank you, Chair. Whilst it's great to see the potential for new jobs coming into Hatfield, Hatfield Town Council do believe there are some flaws present with this application. 24 parking spaces doesn't seem a lot for a development of this size. I'll happily accept that many residents of this proposal probably won't end up using a car, but let's say over the weekend that maybe a quarter of them have visitors coming to see them, plus the staff of the hospital and everything else that's going on there. 24 doesn't seem like enough. And whilst we accept that the hospital next door, as I only found out 7 hours ago, may allow the use of their parking spaces, if indeed any are available and they're not full, that's not a permanent agreement. They could turn around tomorrow and say, well, we're not doing that anymore. So that is a concern, because parking in the surrounding area is a significant issue at the best of the time. It's bad for those of you. I know there aren't many councillors on this committee from Hatfield, but it is a pretty dire area. We already have issues in and around this area. for businesses on the business park who, when their car parks are full, direct their staff to go and park on local streets. So it's already chock-a-block around there, and I'm genuinely concerned that if there is not sufficient on-site provision for this, that the problem could spill out further and exacerbate the problem for our residents who already, in some cases, are struggling to park outside their own homes, which is not really an unreasonable demand to be able to park within a reasonable walking distance of your house. I also note comments from the residents, some of which were referenced in the officer's report, about the potential for overlooking and how much bigger the proposal is in height to surrounding houses, particularly on Manor Road, which I feel needs sort of particular consideration for people not having their light blocked out and being overlooked by this proposal. In short, at the moment, we don't necessarily object to the proposal of having this facility here, just in its current form. It isn't right. It's not right for the site in its current form. And I just have to say, please don't exacerbate the issues this area of Hatfield already has. Please reject this application, encourage the applicant to reconsider it, redesign it into a more suitable size and bulk with better on-site parking provision, and then hopefully Hatfield Town Council will be in a position to not have to be sitting here tonight. Thank you.
Ask the officers to deal with the parking matter first, because I'm sure a lot of you want to talk about that.
Well, the parking guideline figure, as I say, is 19 spaces. The application was originally submitted with 20. We sought additional provision, but within the constraints of the site, 24 is the maximum without, which could fit within the front site frontage. The site is within a sustainable location in terms of accessibility and bus routes. The applicants have provided details of staffing levels, and at maximum occupation, the care home would employ up to 24 people. And presumably not all of those would travel to the site by private car, and there is now submitted the travel plan to support alternative means of transport.
Okay, so would be the number that comes out of working the figures, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Right, councillors. Yes.
No, I think, I've gone red, but you can go first if you like.
Alan's bleeping.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm very pleased to see this application come forward. You know, I think I'm very aware that mixed use residential care, so providing residential care and nursing, is very much needed in the borough, and the fact that it includes dementia care beds is vitally important. As we know, we're seeing more and more people with living longer and with dementia, so there's definitely a demand. I accept Councillor Broach's concerns about the parking, but I was somewhat reassured by para 10.23 on page 40. So the council's parking services team are aware that there could be a potential problem, and that's why they've requested the planning obligation in order to do surveys pre and post. When the hospital next door came forward to this committee for consideration, I remember the residents being very concerned about parking problems in Manor Road as well, and so it's something I think this committee is very aware of, and anything we can do to try and avoid further problems for residents is very important, and I think that planning obligation would address that. I think the developers have gone some way to making this quite a nice design. They've included amenity space, which is important, especially as the windows are going to be sealed. And when I first read that, I'm thinking, oh, okay, I can understand why. It's to reduce noise, etc., etc. But actually, the residents need some outside amenity space, which has been included in the design. I note that there's been quite a bit of consideration given to screening, so soft landscaping with the barrier of Manor Road, which again should hopefully protect the residents' amenity value at that aspect. I was a bit concerned to see the NHS that they hadn't responded to your request for further information. Obviously now they have, but yet still it appears that it's only that small portion for mental health which applies, and that's a bit of a shame that there's not more that could be done there on that obligation. I was pleased to note that there is going to be no pedestrian access from Manor Road, because that was something that people were concerned about, and residents were, because obviously that could then contribute to more people, perhaps staff, parking in Manor Road and walking through. But that has been addressed, I think, by officers, which is good to see. There were conditions applied about the noise and vibration concerns, so that's good. Mechanical ventilation being installed. So on the whole, I think it's a good proposal. It's not perfect. The design is probably a bit Marmite, so some people will like it, some people don't. But that's a personal opinion. Japanese knotweed, that's the big concern I have, because I've seen enough programmes to know that can grow through concrete and walls, and so I note that it's been on the site for quite a number of years. So I'm a bit concerned that it's only just coming now that somebody needs to do something about it, unless I've misread that. I'll stop there, Chair. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
The parking around there is an absolute nightmare. I mean, even now it's an absolute nightmare. I think if this came with like 100-bay underground car park, I'd be really happy to support it. Of course, it looks beautiful. We want to support care and, mental health and health generally, etc. But the parking is an absolute nightmare. HR departments in companies on the business park are actually instructing staff to park in the surrounding areas. It's hugely disruptive. There are residents that have to walk with their toddlers in the road because parking is so haphazard. I mean, it's really appalling. So I don't think that the parking is enough. I mean, if there's 24 staff there, there's 24 bays. I mean, I'm 24 full-time staff. Oh, not always on site. But, I've got an A-level in maths. I mean, I can sort of see that just isn't going to work and that there will be overspill. And I think it's, hugely detrimental to the residents that live in that area. I really do. Although, of course, everyone is going to support the principle of it. But without the parking, the fact that other studies need to be conducted at this point, when already there's loads of evidence that the parking in the area just doesn't work. So for that reason, unfortunately, I would, have to decline this as it currently stands. As I say, I'm happy to look at the revised plans with the 100-bay underground car park. That would be perfect. But, unfortunately, I'd have to say no. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Chair. Yeah, I was just looking at the Porsche garage next door with the noise and pollution, because these are high performance cars that even when they're parked in the car park there, they do rev up and what have you. But at the same time, it might give the residents something to look at. There you go. Yeah. The other thing about the residents in Manor Road, there are plenty of other sites on the old aerospace site that look onto a blank wall of a factory or warehouse. Now, looking on to these buildings, I'm sure they'd appreciate this building rather than putting another warehouse on that site. But let's put it this way, they are responsible mechanics in Porsche, but they do take that roundabout a bit sharpish. And when you're talking about residents having to walk into the road, we are between a rock and a hard place, because if we can get residents that live in Welwyn Hatfield in there for their own benefit, we benefit from the housing that they leave behind. So what we've got to do is balance what is good and what is bad. And at the moment, I'm favouring it'll be good for the residents, as in Manor Road, seeing a fairly decently designed building, as opposed to a blank wall. But I think we've got to emphasise that the hospital next door should take it on themselves that they could be pushing their patients into that care home. So I think they should work together with their parking. But again, you've got to look at the staff using these car parks, and yeah, I think you've got to look at what is good and bad, and all I can see is the good side is coming up trumps for me, and I'll have to go with the officers. Thanks.
What the committee needs to do is look at whether it complies with policies and guidance, rather than quite whether it's good or bad. And we have heard that the parking complies with our standards. So just bear that in mind. We see a lot of applications where the parking does not comply or is a few short, and we're told that it'll probably be okay because it's a few short. In this case, we're told that the parking is a few more than the standard. So, Steve? Oh, Pankits. Yep, okay.
Next door neighbor to, is that something, you said it hasn't been confirmed, what was that, sorry?
Thank you. The adjoining occupier is a hospital, recently completed hospital, and they, the operator of the hospital, have confirmed by email that they would support the application and allow their car park to be used as overspill in times when this car park is at capacity. That's the extent of the detail provided, and as I said earlier, it's not binding, and so should only be given limited weight.
That shouldn't be considered as a one of the plus point or anything, isn't it? Okay. The another concern I have is with regards to the overlooking. Have we looked anything? Because looking at the height of the building, I can see that we'll be definitely overlooking the properties on the Manor Road. Has that been considered at all?
Yes, overlooking has been considered, and given the separation distances and the fact that it is a 3-storey building, it's not overly high in comparison to the properties on the other side of Manor Road. The separation distance, the closest property, I believe, is 28 metres.
Okay, thank you.
Steve?
Councillors have identified the issue, and as has James on behalf of the town council, parking is the issue, but as Stephen has said, it complies with our regulations. That's our fault. We've been time and time again on this committee asking our planners to make sure that we have area relevant parking requirements, and yet it doesn't happen. Our motto here is first do no harm, and the chances are that we will do harm here. I think Councillor Bell has cited that we should not allow access, and I think so long as officers, as part of the planning, the planting, etc., bear that in mind, that no access to Manor Road should be possible, then I think that's fair enough. The other thing is that I would ask officers to do is to possibly ask the client to work to get a more formal arrangement with the hospital next door to try and see if they can head off any potential parking issues before they actually arise, in which case we can maybe live up to our motto of first doing no harm. It's always very difficult when you've got care homes. The applicant will always want to get the maximum number of beds, and when you have things like dementia care and ordinary aged care together, you have to have the bulk to be able to have to make it work economically, because the dementia care is very much more expensive, and if you can spread staff over more than one discipline, you can be more economical and make it more viable. So I can quite see why the applicant wants 75. I'm inclined with James. It would be nice if we could have worked a little bit harder to get it down, but we are only considering this application and admiring Alan's sagacity. I think it is an on-balance thing, and on balance this will do more good than harm, and certainly if we can get officers to work on the car parking and the planting issues to assure residents that there will be no overspill, then I think we can get a satisfactory result all round, and for that reason I'm going to support this recommendation.
John? Thank you. And Nick, secondly. All those in favour?
Is there any way we can get those points into the mix in any way that trying to encourage the applicant to work to more formalise the parking arrangements and
with the hospital?
Yeah, and to ensure that the planting does, the officers' main concern of the planting is no access from. Is there any way we can strengthen that up in the
respond on, in terms of the planting, the landscaping schemes already been very well worked up, and you can see the detail on the screen. However, we still have included a recommendation for a landscaping condition to finalise some of the details, which included boundary treatment, so we would be able to control a fence, for example, along that Manor Road boundary.
But what about the parking next door?
Right, in relation to parking, we've obviously got the obligation for the £50,000 towards a parking study. However, to bind somebody who's not part of the application site into a section 106, which would then obligate them forever, wouldn't be reasonable or appropriate and comply with the test within the regulations.
Okay. Right, so we've had a proposal and a second on that. All those in favour of accepting the officer's recommendation, please show. And those against? That's 12 to 2. So that is carried. Right, agenda item 8, which is the former Roche Products site at 40 Broadwater Road, change of use of the former Roche Products factory to provide 34 residential units across basement, ground and first to third floors with associated external alterations, including excavation to the rear light well of southern elevation, additional and altered fenestration to the northern and southern elevations, creation of additional car parking and associated landscaping, together with the internal alterations, including the subdivision and reconfiguration of floor space, the introduction of 5 new spiral staircases and provision of servicing within the building.
Well done. Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I'd like to apologise for the issue with the paragraph numbers in various parts of the report. There clearly appears to be an issue with the formatting, so apologies for that. This application seeks planning permission for the conversion of the former Roche Products factory and office to provide 34 residential units, be a mix of 10 one-bed units and 24 two-bedroom units. The key issues to mention in this introduction are the previously proposed community use, the viability of the scheme and the ability of it to provide affordable housing in accordance with the Council's policy, and issues around car parking. All other matters are covered in the officer report. Members may be aware that when planning permission was granted in 2010 for the wider redevelopment of this site, this building was proposed to be used for community uses. As is set out in the report, potential occupiers for this use and later for a potential office use were sought. Whilst there were some inquiries, in particular for the use of the building by a church group, none of these came to fruition. The situation now As well as this, BMP have run various sensitivity tests based on different affordable tenure mixes and following further work by the applicant on the benchmark land value. At present day costs and values, the scheme cannot afford to support on-site affordable housing. However, and for those of you who were present at the member viability training last night will know, even small changes in sales values can impact the financial outputs of a development quite significantly. And BMP have suggested that this may be one such case. As a result of this, members will note that the heads of terms at the top of page 79 includes the requirement for a viability review mechanism. Members will note that the development is able to support a number of other planning obligations that have been requested and agreed. Turning to the issue of car parking, the proposed development generates a requirement for 31.5 car parking spaces, according to our own guidance. What is proposed is 37 car parking spaces. It is noted that up until recently, and it may still be the case, much of the area that is proposed for car parking in this scheme was being used for unauthorised parking by others, be they residents of neighbouring properties or commuters using the train station. The applicant has written to the occupiers of the neighbouring buildings and has made known that these spaces have been being used without authorisation and that this should cease. It is the case that some of those using these spaces may be displaced. If they are commuters, they will seek to park elsewhere. If they are residents of the neighbouring properties, they should revert to using their own allocated spaces on the adjacent site. To conclude on this issue, the level of car parking proposed is in excess of the policy requirement by 5 spaces, and so is found to be acceptable. Thank you, Chair.
Before we move on to the speakers, can I just ask for a point of clarification? There's 2 applications in front of us. Is discussion or commentary about the heritage aspects relevant to the first application that we're currently talking about? Are we taking these 2 applications as a single discussion? Can we have just some clarity about how this will be dealt with?
So the first speaker on this is Andrea Herrick, who is the agent.
Thank you. Just to clarify, I'm only speaking once, so I won't be speaking to the second one. You'll be pleased to know. Thank you. So, as confirmed, I'm Andrea Herrick from Rapley's, acting on behalf of Taylor Wimpey for the applications. The applications were submitted in September last year, and we are delighted that, having worked closely with your officers, the applications are recommended for approval. As explained, Taylor Wimpey has completed the development of the wider site, and despite a concerted marketing campaign for the Roche product factory, this has failed to attract a commercial or community use since the building became vacant in 2009. The property has been targeted by vandals, and despite the owner's efforts to secure the building, it has been the subject of break-ins with damage being caused. Taylor Wimpey has therefore been speaking with officers at the council over a number of years to explore the scope for the residential conversion of the building. The site is not protected for either employment or community uses, and a residential use is consistent with the council's land use policies. In heritage terms, it is acknowledged that whilst the conversion will cause some low-level harm, as would likely be the cause for any new use, this is not deemed to be significant, particularly when weighed against the heritage benefits arising through the repair, the reinstatement and reuse of key original features, and in securing the long-term preservation of the building. The proposals will deliver a high-quality residential development that readily complies with standards for internal space, cycle, car parking and refuse provision, and provides an acceptable level of residential amenity. Whilst there has been some concern expressed in relation to car parking, the proposed car parking spaces are not allocated to existing residents, and their use, which may include commuters, is unauthorised. The application in fact exceeds the council's parking standards, and there has been no objection from officers or county highways. The applicant has submitted a viability assessment in support of the proposal, setting out the predicted cost and anticipated delivery of the scheme. This has been reviewed with the Council's own independent assessors, who have confirmed the scheme cannot support the provision of on-site affordable housing. Finally, it is noteworthy that the majority of local representations have confirmed support, with residents pleased to see this long-term vacant building, which has attracted antisocial behaviour, turned into housing. It is recognised the conversion will secure a sensitive refurbishment and the listed building's long-term preservation. The proposals have also secured the support of the local civic groups, the 20th Century Society and Roche, which has offered to provide archive photographic material for display in the building. In summary, the proposals will provide 34 apartments within a highly sustainable location that will help meet Welwyn Garden City's housing requirement. Significantly, the proposals will secure the optimum viable use for the former Roche product factory. It will bring back into use an important listed building that has remained vacant for almost 10 years and has suffered from vandalism. The refurbishment will enable the key heritage features of the building and its wider setting to be restored and enjoyed for the long term. The proposals will secure our high residential quality design and meet all relevant standards, including car parking. I would therefore kindly request that you approve these applications in accordance with your officer's recommendation. Thank you.
Yes, this one seems to be working now. I asked this application be brought to committee for the reasons set out in the report. Fellow Ward Councillor Helen Beckett has also raised the same concerns. I have no issue with the principle of conversion to residential, and I'm not going to speak on the aspects of the listed building. Nearby residents have commented on two themes. Firstly, welcomed that a project should bring to an end the vandalism and neglect of this important building so close to their homes. But secondly, concern over parking spaces. In terms of the parking, the spaces allocated in this application are already in use, indeed very heavily used, probably a mix of residents and commuters. If these spaces are withdrawn from general use, there may be a lack of sufficient spaces and spillage to surrounding residential roads takes place. It is for this reason I asked for a specific study into whether this was likely, but no response and no action. I'm not clear what action would be taken if the nearby roads became overparked as a result of this application being granted. I ask that my concerns over this be recorded in the minutes. And I have to say, I really do think that Taylor Wimpey should have much earlier moved to make it clear that these spaces were not available to people at present, rather than letting the thing go on and then putting in an application to reuse them. I suggest the application is deferred until a parking study has taken place. In terms of community use, this building was allocated for community use in the SPD. However, events have moved on, and while it is likely there will be community provision in the shredded wheat site, there is a new application which has not yet been determined, still less implemented, so there's no guarantee of community provision. And in any case, the Taylor Wimpey development, of which this is the final part, is separated in ownership and distance from the north of the shredded wheat site. Ironically, there was nearby community space while Highway's house opposite was being used by Christchurch, who generously allowed community uses, but they have moved away. I suggest the residents of the Taylor Wimpey site should have their own community space, perhaps 1 or 2 rooms. This was suggested by the case officer around a year ago, but was just to be an archive store. However, the principle was agreed. It does seem to me that if an SPD is written saying this should be community use, it shouldn't be entirely discarded. Finally, there is the complete lack of social housing, just a very modest financial contribution. You'll have read of the Housing Department's concerns over this, and I welcome Councillor Perkins' comments last night at the viability training session on this subject. But words must be backed by action. We have to grasp the nettle firmly and show we mean business. A Section 106 payment of £50,000 across 34 units is tiny, and approximately 15,000 of this for other things. If this application is not deferred, I ask it to be refused for the reasons I've given.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I note that the agent says the potential harm to the structure of the building in heritage terms is low level and not significant. Well, that disagrees with the heritage officer's assessment that's in this paper, where they say at paragraph 8.6, the change of use and alterations to the building would significantly harm the significance and setting of the listed building and would not conform with the MPPF. Now, I would suggest that if the heritage officer of the Borough Council is saying that the application that we are viewing today will damage the heritage of this building, that actually we should take that as a significant and give that substantial weight in our consideration of whether planning application should be approved or not. I also note that a number of the supporting statements from residents all refer to the condition and state of the building. And I think actually Taylor Wimpey should be hanging their head in shame that actually they've allowed a heritage building in their ownership to languish in this state. Bluntly, as I understand the heritage regulations, if you are the owner of a building, you are obligated to maintain it in a reasonable and sensible condition. And actually to allow this building to deteriorate to the point where residents are seeing vandalism and damage as being something that needs to be fixed by development of housing is, for me, an attempt to play the system. Okay? And I think that we should not take that into account when we come to our decision about the planning balance. For me, it's quite clear that the planning balance here is that we should reject this application, because what we're doing, if we allow it to go forward, is not taking due account of the heritage aspects of our own officers. And I think on that grounds, I will be voting to refuse this application. I think the planning balance suggests that we should turn it down.
Okay, yes.
I'm back on.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to come back on the point about heritage. Is that okay? The Council's previous conservation officer did indeed object in the terms set out in the report. The role of the planning officer is to consider all of the representations made and to weigh them in the balance. What we're required to do with heritage is where the harm identified is considered to be less than substantial in MPPF terms, which is, in my opinion, what would be the case here. We have to weigh that against the public benefits of the proposal. And in this case, the public benefits are the delivery of housing and the long-term restoration and maintenance of this listed building. And so when we're considering the heritage issues, that's the particular balance in that topic area that we need to have and that the MPPF requires us to have.
But clearly, your opinion of how that balance comes out might differ from others, and I would suggest differs from mine. And it is purely a difference of opinion as to whether an aspect that has been brought to our attention by an officer is substantial or not. In my opinion, looking particularly at the second application that discusses the heritage impacts in more detail, and the heritage officer on page 95 is quite scathing about the aspects of this development that, or the proposed development that they feel is damaging to the infrastructure and heritage aspects and setting of the heritage building. I think that, for me, the balance should be that this application is refused. I hope that helps explain.
Thank you. Irene?
Yes. Is this one? Right. No, I can't go along with officer's recommendation on them for two reasons. For the first reason, I totally agree with Councillor Sikowski, because I can't understand how a heritage building can get into such a state. But the main one I'm concerned about is I was planning last night, and every application for houses, we try to say that we need 30% affordable housing. Well, we know full well that a lot of people can't do it for 30%, which we go along with, and we try to adjust it to what they can afford. But to actually put in an application so we don't get a single house or a flat that is going to be affordable, and they're doing all this, they've come up with a scenario of 106 that I think adds up to £17,703 altogether. So for that money, they can get the application without an affordable home. I can't go along with officer's recommendation with that. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. I'll come back to you just a moment. Steve. As is usual in these cases, we are not provided with the calculation of the assessment of profit. Four units, 10 one bed, 24 two bed. One beds go for about 250 round here, 300,000 for two bed times square figures. So that's about, it come out to about 9.7 million. We were told last night that if you're doing a backward appraisal, you'd take about 18 or 20% as the expected profit, which would give you 20%, 1.94 million profit on the scheme. Now, I've no idea whether that's true or not, because I've not been given the figures, nor has any member of this committee. And at 1.94 million, they can't afford £110,000 for one house. One house. We need, as a council, I think, to sort out how the committee is given information on the viability. Because we're talking here, we don't know. We don't know whether they're having a very cheap construction, and so they're getting 2.5 million profit, or actually all sorts of other things, because of the listed building, they're only having 1 million profit. We don't know. Yes.
Sorry. Can I just say, just in terms of the viability assessment, you have, as a council, employed BNP Paribas to undertake that assessment. And they've undertaken that, and I assume provided information to your officers. They've set out at 9.20 that the agreed profit between BNP Paribas and the applicants is 20%. That's a normal developer profit. That's not unusual. They've also set out that you have got a listed building here which adds abnormal costs to a build. And you've got asbestos in there. So abnormal costs and your build costs are all part of the viability assessment. Your own advisors have said that this development is unviable and can't provide affordable housing. But what they have also said is that through the course of the development, the sales costs will be taken into account, and when 25 units have been occupied and sold, a reassessment will take place. And if, as you assume, more money does come out of this, then the council will have the ability to claim that element of profit back and have an affordable housing contribution that you can use. If this goes to appeal, that information that you as a council have accepted and your advisors have looked at will be before an inspector, and he will think that a 20% profit is acceptable, and that's what you've agreed. So the likelihood of this on appeal winning is quite large. I accept that you're not getting any affordable housing units on site, But quite realistically, even if you had one on site, there are very few registered providers who would be prepared to take one unit in a scheme. So when it's a very low proportion and you have a viability assessment, you really have the best opportunity to obtain a contribution in the long term.
That's true. But as councillors, we don't know the figures. That's the problem. I know.
Your assessors have done that.
I know, but we haven't seen that. It would be handy if we had. Mike?
Thank you. I actually welcome this development. I know we've had the problem with not having a social housing, and that from last night's training course, we know the reason why, etc. Right. I know this building very well. I actually worked on the site for 28 years. And this building, especially as I keep calling it Building 1, the main building that looks onto Broadwater Road, it is a beautiful building that is in desperate need of refurbishment. And as long as the Taylor Wimpey will develop this building to get it back to not quite what it was, but produce accommodation in that it's got all the panelling and etc. And the person who gets the flat that has the boardroom as the living room, it's going to be one heck of a flat. And I must say, because when I saw this from Rapley's this morning, I actually forgot that they do actually have that beautiful fireplace. The other question is, once we get this, if we approve this, and it retains all the panelling and etc., if that then is bought, the flat is bought, I take it because it's a listed building, they cannot remove that fireplace or do any alterations without getting listed building consent. Yeah. And the other thing is, I think I saw it in the plan. The fence, the steel fence that surrounds the outside, is that going? Oh, so do I. When Ross put it up, I thought it was terrible.
I believe it is.
Because it spoils the look of that building. And the other one, I don't know if anyone know that. On this site, there is various tunnels that goes from, oh yes, there is a set of tunnels that goes from this building through, from that building from Broadwater, no, not this building, from Broadwater Road side, what I call Building 1. It'll actually go through the site, or was going through the site, to the Biopark building. And off branches thereof. It's actually quite good going through the site when it was chucking down the rain. You go through the tunnels. But I will be supporting the officer recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
I think you'll know what I'm going to come up with.
Go on, Alan, let's hear it.
It's a case of, when it comes up to the point that we couldn't give it to anybody else, but we're going to put apartments on there because we need the housing. Yes, we are desperate for housing, but social housing we are desperate for. Not for new houses and flats where commuters are moving out of London to Welwyn Garden City, jump on a train, spend their money in London. We need social housing. Now, with all due respect, Taylor Wimpey could make a nice little splash in the newspapers by donating. Is that a good word? To the people of Welwyn Hatfield to say, yeah, we're a charitable institution. Not really. But it would be nice because it's going to come up time and time again. And it came up last night when I said, buildings of this age have all got asbestos. So whatever building of this age, you're going to come up with this thing of asbestos. But I like Paul's thing on the heritage, but again, weighing the good and the bad. I just want to make my point that...
Don't forget the ugly.
I just want to make the point that I wish that hearing now that at the end of it, if we do hear that the profit's been made and we can get even 20% of social housing on this site, then fair enough. I'll have to go with offices, but I'd just like to make a point that I wish we could get a few social housing, because as I say, we are desperate for social housing, not for those moving out of London into a nice leafy town and then not spending their hard-earned cash locally.
They will at the weekend.
Yeah. Okay, so...
Yes, sorry, it's me again.
One of the things I wanted to say is that we could look at making the entire thing social housing, and that way we wouldn't have the problem with the. There was some, there was an example that we were looking at where the profitability on an entirely social housing development worked very well in terms of the analysis we were shown yesterday.
Yeah.
So just an idea.
Yes,
Yeah, but they'll see how to spend the money, won't they?
would be able to sell the whole development immediately to a housing association, and therefore wouldn't have the risk of not being able to sell the commercial units. That's what we were shown last night. Okay. Mandy.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm very mindful of the training that we had last night, and I'm very mindful of the fact that our consultants have again said that this site is not viable. However, we talked a lot last night about a review mechanism, and I don't know whether it's possible, but it would be very helpful if a review mechanism, if we could have a clause in the okay, there is one. Okay, to have a review mechanism. I'm also very aware, and I agree with you, that 1 or 2 units in a building of this size no housing association wants to take on.
Yeah.
And I'm also aware that when we're talking about a review, it's then too late, in fact, to get affordable housing on the site. However, we will be considering a planning application for the next door site within a period of time, within the next probably year or so. And therefore, if we were able to get some, at a review point, some affordable housing contributions, we may well be able to do something with the rest of the Broadwater Road site in order to have some affordable housing close by, rather than the problem that we would normally have is that we would get a contribution but we wouldn't have anywhere to put it. So I think if committee tonight should be minded to make a decision, the review is absolutely paramount, and we need to be looking at the review in conjunction with the other site along that road.
Can we tell the two to do that? We can't really.
What's recommended in the report is that the review kicks in on the occupation, I believe it is, of the 25th unit, or sale of 25th unit. We can't compel the owner of the building to build these units on the same time frame as the scheme next door, but we can certainly, as an authority, look to identify additionality on the site next door as an opportunity for spending any contribution if the viability improves to the extent that we actually secure any.
Thank you, Chairman. Until I heard the passionate call from Mike, I was absolutely quite persuaded by Paul Zukowski's approach. And when I look at paragraph 10.1, officers themselves are saying that it's only on balance considered acceptable. I do fear that we are potentially rewarding negligence. And it's something we've encountered before, and the truth is we've tended to be pragmatic and say that we have to ignore what's gone before, and now we've got an opportunity to stop the rot. And that's when Mike's enthusiasm for the building sort of started getting into me. At least we've got an opportunity now to stop the rot. I am concerned that officers are fully aware of the parking issues, yet there is not one penny piece put down as recommended to be retained for a parking review. We will do harm here. That's not our purpose. At least if we can get appropriate evidence, and I've called before for us to do a borough-wide review of how apartments are impacting on overspill parking. Now, some of the parking is going to be for those who cheapskates want to get to London, etc. But others will be offset parking from the apartments that are already in the area. So what we are doing here is adding to the problem, and yet we're not even trying to get some money to try and see if we can solve the problem. It's an absurdity. So with that, and together with the, I think Paul's telling remark about the heritage approach, and although I get the officer has sort of downplayed that, I really am torn into, and again on balance, it's only Mike's enthusiasm that's persuaded me from saying on balance I completely disagree with this application, but I think in the final analysis, without anything going towards investigating parking, I'm not prepared to support it. And if officers have got some kind of suggestion on that area, I'm willing to listen to it. But I'm not here to add harm to the amenity value of people's environment.
Yeah. Yes?
Sorry.
Oh, right. Go on, Paul. You go first.
Irene.
Right. 9.26, it says recommended a viability review mechanism. Can we actually put that in the recommendation? 9.26, which is what Mandy has just said. So that will be in. So
25th Sal.
25th Sal.
That kicks in.
Right. So can you just clarify, if other property developers come along and say, I want to put these amount of houses, but I can't afford any affordable housing, what do we say? If they turn around and say, Roche did it, they didn't even know how to put up one.
No, we would, in the same way, we would go through the viability studies, and on a big enough scheme, we would go out to our professional advisors and we would compare their advice to the developer's advice. In this case, the professional advisors agreed with the developer broadly, and we would do the same for every development that didn't provide us with our affordable housing.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Paul?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of reiterate the point that I feel the current owner of the property has not really addressed the heritage issues that they're obliged to address in an appropriate way, and that makes me have significant concerns going forward in heritage terms. And I point you at paragraph 9.5 of this particular report, where it's looking at marketing considerations as you know, the applicant submitting a marketing assessment. The marketing assessment that suggests the building's not viable as office or community use quite clearly says in the second to last sentence, the analysis did not identify the asking price. Well, given that this is, you know, this isn't viable and we're going to have an application, why are they unwilling to tell us what the asking price for that unit was? And when it's followed with the next sentence, the sales particulars indicated obligations to undertake outstanding repairs to the listed structure, goes some way to explain, I think, what's going on. That if your sales particulars say you take on a lease on this building and you've got to fix all the stuff that's currently wrong with it, as well as anything that might subsequently happen to it, shows a rather lax approach to managing a listed building, in my opinion. Can we refer to the next paper at this point in terms of response to Mike, in terms of, you know, a fantastic building that would be a good place to live? Because I think there's some points in the officer's report that are relevant to that. So in 8.2 of the next application, the Borough Council Conservation Officers talking about the changes to the building that, in their opinion, constitute significant harm to the heritage aspects. A reduction and loss of openness within the building. You're talking about the chairman's, the boardroom. Will that boardroom be in one piece, or will it be chopped up into a number of apartments? And actually, does that not lose its impact and grandeur? There's a question in here, or a response in here, that the development as proposed will make additional openings in the floor slabs. So are they going to cut a hole in the floor of that boardroom? So I think there's some really serious questions here about what's going to happen to this building in heritage terms. And I really don't think that, given their record with it, we should be trusting Taylor Wimpey to make the future alterations in an appropriate way. I just think on heritage terms, we ought to be rejecting this application.
Thank you, Chair. If I can just come back on a couple of those points. Whilst we're referring to the next item, paragraph 2.3 of that report, the proposal, sets out the key heritage and architectural features which would be retained. And amongst other things, that includes the boardroom at first floor, the parquet floor, fireplace, original bronze window frames, panelling and wooden window surrounds. I think the view of the conservation officer who commented on the application was very much that he didn't want to see this building interfered with. And that's an understandable view from a conservation perspective. But as planning officers, what we have to do is balance that against finding a use for the building. I think, as the applicant's agent said in her speech, if you were to introduce an office use into this building, that would require an element of subdivision. It would require staircases to be inserted in similar ways, perhaps not to quite the intensity of a residential use, but you would still need to interfere with the building and change it from its original layout. And so what we need to do is to consider whether the changes that they proposed in order to deliver a use for the building that can be sustained in the long term are acceptable, having regard to the elements of the listed building that would be restored and maintained, and in our opinion the most important ones would be. Thank you.
It's interesting that I have long thought that is a fundamental mistake in considering a plan application and then considering the same thing for listed building consent. Particularly where it's detailed. Yeah. You could get outline and then deal with the detailed in the listed building, but to deal with two separate ones, I mean, if we were ever in a situation where we approved the first one and rejected the second one, it would seem odd, to say the least. Alan?
Just a question, really. Grade 2 and Grade 1 listed buildings. I used to think Grade 2 listed buildings that you couldn't alter the outside structure, but you could manipulate the inside. But Grade 1, you had to leave the whole building as is.
Grade 2 star and Grade 1 listed buildings are obviously of differing importance, but the rules are the same. It's internal and external alterations.
Okay.
Thank you. I think what's most frustrating, and obviously picking up on what Paul was saying, is, you know, Taylor Wimpey is a large company. They bought this knowing that it was a listed building. As I think you pointed out, odds are with an older building, the likelihood of asbestos is probably quite high. So, you know, they're a big company. They don't go into purchases without some degree of knowledge. And I think that's where the frustration comes in, because, you know, it's not like me going to buy a listed building. I wouldn't have a clue what I was doing. And so there is an element of, you know, allowing the building to fall into disrepair. Surely there must be some obligations and responsibilities to owning a grade 2 listed building. And I would ask you to take that back to Taylor Wimpey for future you know, properties and developments that you may own or be purchasing, because actually there is an element. It's been allowed to fall into disrepair, and now we're being asked to consider an application. On the one hand, if we say no, it's just going to fall into further disrepair, and then of course the next stage is complete demolition, which nobody would want to see. So there isn't I think somebody used a word, being held to ransom, I don't know. There is that element of, look, actually you can either, you know, grant the planning permission, or actually the building disintegrates even further. And that, to me, I don't like that aspect. Mike's passion for the building, I take on board. It has remained vacant. It's probably not suitable for office use. So at the very best, then actually accommodation resi is probably quite a good idea, and it would make some beautiful, probably flats. The fact that there is no affordable, and obviously we all are fresh from our training last night, so we're all experts on, you know, viability review mechanisms now. And it is, you know, they're a large company, it's a listed building. There should be some benevolent aspect to it in an ideal world, where Taylor Wimpey would go, yes, we'll do this because actually we think it's the right thing to do. However, that's not what's happening. And I thank you for your advice about, if this went to appeal, an inspector would say, look, you've employed BNP Paribas to do your viability study for you. These are the figures they've come back with. The fact that you don't like them is irrelevant. And we don't like them. We absolutely don't, because we want to see we want all affordable housing. We want every house in the borough to have an affordable element. But the reality is we're not in that position, and we don't have the ability to change it. So with the greatest reluctance, I accept officers' recommendations, because I think, you know, the only mechanism we have is to get this viability review mechanism once the 20th flat is sold. I do have a question, how long that lasts, because obviously if the market hasn't changed substantially by the time the 20th flat is sold, can we then revisit it again if, say, things are slow, can we revisit it in another 10 years or 5 years, or is there a benefit to us doing that? And that's just the only thing I didn't pick up on last night.
The trigger for the review mechanism is the sale of the 25th unit.
Yes.
So whether that happened in 12 months or 2 years, that would be the trigger, and that's the point at which we'd be entitled to review the situation.
Okay. And can we do a subsequent review if we felt there was a need or a...
I would suggest on a scheme of this size, that wouldn't be something I'd advise on a scheme of this size.
The objective of a review mechanism is that you're taking actual sales costs.
Okay.
So at the moment, what's being undertaken by Taylor Wimpey is they're estimating what they think the sales costs would be. Your concern would be that they're underestimating, yes, and they're saying their build costs are higher than they would be. So when you get to your review mechanism, what Taylor Wimpey will then have is what it actually costs them to build, what it costs them to get rid of the asbestos, what it costs them to do the listed building repairs, and they will also, by the time, because it's one building, they will know what all of their sales costs are going to be. Okay. So rather than having estimates, you'll have actuals. So in that situation, it wouldn't benefit you to do another review at any later stage, because that's the data. If you have a very big scheme where you've got lots of phases, then as you go through each phase, you can undertake a separate mechanism, and that's where you can say, okay, they made more money in this phase, so we want more affordable in the next. But in a small scheme, really that's the only way that you can do an effective review mechanism.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Do you know how long Taylor owned the site?
Must be 10 years.
10 years.
Do we know how long they have owned the site?
More than 10 years.
10 years.
Is it 10 years or what?
More than 10 years.
More than 10 years, okay. Right. Okay.
I was going to say, our officer's going to comment on my concern over the lack of provision for investigation into parking issues.
Ask that question again, please.
I expressed concern that there's no money to be allocated, even though officers have identified this as an area used for overspill parking, but there's no requirement for anything to help towards investigating parking issues and to try to alleviate them in the area.
I think there's 2 points to consider there. Firstly, is the level of parking proposed for the scheme meets with our policy requirement. There would be parking displaced, but that parking is unauthorised. They shouldn't be parking there. They don't have the right to park there. And so it's not the applicant's responsibility to source alternative parking for people who shouldn't be parking on that land in the first place.
No, it's ours. We know that it's happening. We can't ignore things, surely.
Well, there are public car parks in the vicinity that people could use, albeit they would have to pay to do so. There is parking provision available. That would be the alternative that people could use for commuting, for example.
So we can't do a thing to investigate and to try and get proper information to be able to make informed decisions. We can't do a darn thing about it.
Separately to this application, there is work ongoing with regard to parking impacts in the local area. Obviously, members will be aware of the planning permission granted previously on the shredded wheat site, and as a result of that, there is baseline work going on in the surrounding area to establish the existing parking levels on street in order that the impacts of future development on that site can be taken into account. That does cover this part of Welwyn Garden City, but it's not directly related to this application.
So an applicant that is potentially adding to the problem doesn't have to pay a penny piece towards trying to resolve the problem.
Sorry, I totally agree with what you're saying about letting it go into disrepair. It's very naughty of them. But the one thing I wanted to say in terms of the inputs into the reports, if we haven't even got the purchase price listed, how
We told we ignore the purchase price anyway.
Right.
This will be bought for peanuts, won't it?
Can I just say that the purchase price, so your land value, is part of the evaluation of the viability. So BNP Paribas will have been given that information, and that's just part. How much they paid for the site, how much it costs to remediate, how much it costs to build, and what the sales costs are. They're all inputs that BNP Paribas, who are a very experienced consultancy, will have been given. So it's not something that will have been ignored.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Just another thought. I'd made a note earlier. I think on developments that are coming forward now, I would like to see the inclusion of electric charging points as standard. And I don't know if that's something that we do discuss with developers, but we know there is a move towards electric cars, and yet we're not seeing any inclusion of electric charging points. And that's something I think we should be saying to developers, actually, you need to be considering it. Why, thank you. Occasionally I do make one.
Have it. Now, from what you've heard tonight, the applicant is a developer that makes its money from selling properties, which is right and proper. There's nothing wrong with that. And the scheme that is in front of us now, in a sense, what's happened before, even though it is since 2009, is not actually relevant. It is what is in front of us right now. What is going to be done to the building, the number of houses and the number of units. And we will have to accept the viability that was provided by the applicant and checked by our own people as being the figures we have in front of us. That's how, yeah.
Just before you move to a vote, if that's where you're headed, can I just clarify a point on page 79 with regard to the planning obligations contributions? The first sum of money should be £3,535. It gives the impression there, I think, due to the use of a comma, that it's 3 million. That's clearly not correct. And with regard to the contribution to affordable housing, it's the viability review mechanism, and it's a payment of £50,000 that's included.
Yes.
Thank you.
Those in, yes. Oh, right, yes. Okay, and Mike seconded it. Right. Those in favour of accepting the recommendation, please show. (11, 12). Those against? 3. So everybody voted? Those in favour again? (11 and 3). Okay, thank you. Right, item number 9 is the same again, but the heritage aspect.
Thank you, Chair. This application follows the previous item and seeks detailed listed building consent for the works to the former factory and office buildings. As I've already pointed out, of particular note and set out on page 92, the key heritage and architectural features of the building be retained and restored. In particular, the overall geometric shape, the staircases and associated detailing, external doors, travertine walls and floors, the boardroom and its attendant features, the concierge and reception room. As has already been noted, the council's former conservation officer did make objections to the proposals. However, these have been set against the wider considerations made in the planning application, which we've already discussed. Thank you, Chair.
Approve the first rush application, and for some reason, could we then just refuse the second one? Is that?
Could do.
We could do.
Yeah.
But I would imagine on appeal. Of the
oh.
Right.
Just to clarify, though, they are different applications and there are different weighing up considerations, which is why they are both in front of you. So just as a matter of course, because you're minded in one direction on one element, you don't have to be, and that applies both way round. So don't assume you disregard it because you made an early decision. That would be a dangerous precedent for this committee to get into. You still need to consider them both and be aware of the aspects of them, and you've done that by reading the reports and taking that vote. But yeah, don't presume you have to go one direction just because you've already gone a direction with a previous application.
There wasn't a second. There. So.
It is similar to the EMS scheme, where you have planning and approved under the EMS scheme. Right, item number 10 is 16, the Meadway, Cuffley.
The proposal is for the erection of a detached annex in the rear garden following the demolition of the existing shed, studio and greenhouse. You will have received earlier this week a late representation circulated by email. The proposal is presented due to an objection from North Orr and Cuffley Parish Council, due to them considering that the proposal appears to be a residential accommodation and not an annex. They consider it's inappropriate development and no way replaces existing structures equivalently. As you will note from the previous plan, the site is located on the eastern side of the Meadway, within relatively close proximity to its junction with Station Road and Cuffley Railway Station. 2 sheds are located in the rear of the garden, and these would, 3 sheds which would be would be demolished to make way for the new building. The existing building is approximately 0.5 metre to 1.2 metres from the boundary, with eaves height of around 2 metres and a ridge height of 3 metres. The proposed building would be between 0.5 and 1.5 metres away from the boundary, so quite comparable, but in some places a little further. Its floor area that it would cover would be larger at 8.8 by 8 metres. Its eaves height would be approximately the same, but its ridge height would increase by 1 metre to 4 metres. This would provide ancillary accommodation, and for members' information, ancillary accommodation is that would ordinarily be found within a dwelling house. And as an annex, it would provide a bedroom, bathroom, dining room, kitchen and lounge for family members of number 16. You will note that there is a condition for the building to remain as ancillary to number 16 and to only be used by family members. From the photos which are to the rear of the presentation, you will see, and on the plans, that a gate does exist to the rear of the garden, which the report indicates was used previously by a dog walker. The case officer has been to the site and scrambled across the land, literally, she informs me, from the station car park to see was there any separate access whereby the property might become an independent residential unit. She indicated it very much was a scramble, that the land levels at the back are such that you wouldn't actually be able to open the gate at present because of the way the gate is there and land levels are there, so you can't physically open it. And additionally, to get access that way, it would be across railway land and therefore it would be trespass. The rear garden is approximately 30 metres long. It's relatively flat and therefore overlooking from the new building to adjoining occupiers is quite limited. And as you can see from the photographs, the boundaries are quite well landscaped, which also helps in mitigating its impact. The design of the building is comparable to many other other dwellings within the vicinity, and there is a condition for materials to be submitted. In relation to the Parish Council's objection, the proposal does not necessarily have to be equivalently replace an existing building. You could have no building at the rear of the garden, this proposed, and it has to be assessed on its own merits. The proposal doesn't require a change in parking provision due to 3 spaces being provided already. And you may be familiar and know in its proximity to the station, there are actually parking restrictions on the Meadway, which means that there is no parking on a Monday to Friday between 11 a.m. and to 1 p.m. So people would be restricted and should have appropriate facilities on site. Subject to the conditions, the application is recommended for approval. Thank you, Chair.
2 speakers on this. Andrea Allgood, who's an objector.
By all means. Would you like to explain it? Well, I can do. Thank you. Councillor Bolton and colleagues, I represent the Residents' Association and also live on the Meadway, where there are 70 bungalows, mostly occupied by the retired. All the properties have long gardens. So other residents may also wish to house family members from elsewhere in the UK or beyond at low cost in a garden dwelling. Whilst we sympathise with this aspiration, we are opposed to detached, self-contained dwellings in rear gardens, regardless of who's living there. We are extremely concerned about the precedent that approval of this application would set for the whole area, particularly as the Meadway plot sizes and design of properties allow for conventional attached brick-built extensions. This proposed outbuilding, as said, would be wood-clad and fully equipped for independent living for a new household, with the possibility of 2 double bedrooms. We feel that the planning condition limiting use to family members only is totally unenforceable. Also, with the existing property having 4 bedrooms, we are concerned about parking for a total of 6 bedrooms, particularly as the garage is designated as access for the new dwelling. Para 5.1 of the WellHat 205 Supplementary Design Guidance sets out the design criteria for extensions, of which granny annexes are specified as one type of extension. Para 5.1 is quoted in the planning report as a rationale for approval. This para, though, does not appear to include provision for granny being parked away from the existing property in a wooden outbuilding at the bottom of a dark garden. It is commonly understood that an extension, as stated in para 5.1, an extension to a property is attached to it. Should you approve this application for what is beds in sheds, we can expect that many others will follow the precedent, both in Cuffley and across the borough. We trust that councillors do not wish to encourage this in our area, particularly as you have an ethos of do no harm. That particular photo is taken from my property. I don't know what's happened since your photos were taken, but there seems to have been a diminution of hedges and trees and whatever. And I will be looking from my bedroom straight into the bifolding doors that are proposed for this beds in shed structure. Thank you.
And the Bob Stubbs from Cutlin Northaw Parish Council.
Thank you. The applicant made an application for an annex. It's been assessed as an annex, and I hope to convince you it's not an annex. It's a 2-bedroom freestanding residential property built in a back garden. It replaces a collection of sheds. It's not a like-for-like replacement. It's clearly a much bigger building than what's there at the moment. The man in the street, I would suggest, would think of an annex as being complementary to a building, not duplication of it. And you can see that through, say, a hotel. A hotel annex is typically bedroom space. It doesn't include a bar, it doesn't include a reception, it doesn't include a restaurant. That's another hotel. And that's my general guide as to what an annex is. And this isn't an annex, it's a duplication. It's freestanding, it's connected to main sewers and services. It has independent access. Within the application and the report, there's no special pleading of personal circumstances that justify this, where you could see some personal circumstances if the applicant had a disabled child or something like that, where there was something special about it, but there isn't. This is just a freestanding application of I'd like to build a new house in my back garden. I also understand the existing house is under-occupied. Not all 4 bedrooms of that house have people in them. The officer's report relies on 2 key issues. Firstly, the garage door, and secondly, it's family members only. Both these arguments are flawed. The garage access, he argues, is an up and over door, which makes it impossible to have independent access. It's not too difficult to see you can change the door to go through the garage and have a lockable front door instead of an up and over door. And there's nothing in planning you could do to stop that door being replaced. So the argument about an up and over door is just ridiculous. As can be seen as well and has been mentioned, you could get access, perhaps unlawfully for the station car park. With a little work, you could get an unlawful access straight through from the station car park. And it would be worth doing that if you were going to let this out. The family-only condition, I think, is naive. How will it be monitored? What would happen if you enforced and went to court? What does family member mean? Is it a 10th cousin 6 times removed? How will a court interpret what a family member is, and how will you ever determine it? It's just not an enforceable, realistic condition. It doesn't even seem necessary given the personal circumstances of the applicant where he's not demonstrated why he needs this in the first place for so-called family members. It would create a very dangerous precedent where hundreds, literally hundreds of properties in Cuffley, you could argue exactly the same case and build a 2-bedroom house in the back garden. My view is that if it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck and it looks like a duck, it's a duck. And this is a 2-bedroom residential property built in the house in a back garden, and I'd ask you to reject it, and I quite accept that the applicant could come forward with a new application for a 2-bedded house, and that's the way it should have been assessed in the first place. Thank you.
Plan rather than elevation, please. It has to be said that it is an interesting annex, given a living room, a dining room, kitchen, bedrooms. It is a substantial sort of building. I ask the officers, if it were described as a gym and had no internal partitions, and it were 2 metres, if it were 2 metres from the boundary, could it be built under permitted development?
Yes.
It could.
Yes.
Okay. Having the division and the accommodation inside means it needs to have a planning approval plus proximity to the boundary. Yeah. Okay. Who? I've got. Well, Nick, you've hardly said anything tonight. You can go first.
My thoughts on this very much echo what our 2 speakers have just said. I wrote enforcement down across this. I just cannot see how we can enforce the family member issue. And I look at that, and it looks like a house to me. And, you know, the first thing that's going through my head is there's going to be some form of, I know it's speculative, but some form of subletting is going to go ahead. It doesn't feel like an annex to me, so I'm normally supportive of officers, but I can't support this application.
Going red. Thank you. Can I just check with officers? So is the difference, just from my own understanding, the difference between an annex and residential is annex is purely the family connection? Is that in legal terms? Yeah?
Your condition, it refers to family members, but the enforceable part of it is that it says it shall not be occupied at any time other than purposes ancillary to the residential use of the main building. So long as this building is used in an ancillary manner, i.e. by members of the family. It could be an au pair. That might be somebody who's using it ancillary. Normally it would be grandparents or children. But as long as it's used in an ancillary basis, then that condition is enforceable.
Yeah, I mean, like everybody else, when I read through this several times thinking, this looks like a house. And you know, dining room and bedroom and lounge and etc. etc. But I accept if legally we can't refuse it because it meets the ancillary need, then we're in a very difficult position. I'm thinking, what a great idea! I could do it down the bottom of my garden. Actually, move one of my kids out there. All of them, absolutely. I do worry about the enforcement side of it, or, you know, is there a further condition we can put in? So, for example, I know there are some areas where, like beach huts, but you can't occupy it for more than 11 months of a year. And that then gets around the resi bit because there is a restriction. Is that something we could consider if we're absolutely concerned and taking on, you know, local knowledge that actually it's going to be used as a residential property?
I don't think we can ask that. The applicant has asked for this building as an ancillary as ancillary use to his house, and therefore he would expect to use it 12 months a year. And I think enforcement, we will have to accept, is impossible, because we might send our officers round there once or twice to begin with, but 6 months, 12 months, 2 years down the line, unless we have a complaint from somebody, we won't know what's going on. Right, who was next? Irene?
Yes, this is not an annex. I mean, I know I'm old-fashioned, but an annex to me was right up close to the house, virtually joining a house, and that is what I thought was always an annex, not the other end of the garden. So how is that wrong?
I think legally it is an annex. I take what you say about an annex being a bit joined onto your house, but legally, in planning terms, we would accept this as an annex. I expect the officers will tell us that that is the case.
Yeah, but with a bedroom, kitchen, dining room, lounge and a bathroom, that is an annex. That's how we classed. So you're saying it's for family. When did this come in? Has it always been for family?
Yes, it has.
And what does family mean? Because I've got 2 grandsons that got nowhere to live. I've got 4 sheds and 2 summer houses. So can I put one in my garden?
The point isn't, it shouldn't be used even by family independently. So it should be used, an annex is something that is ancillary to the main use of the dwelling. So you have one dwelling house, what an annex is one dwelling house on a site, and the annex needs to be used in an ancillary manner. So as an example, I may have my elderly parents in that annex, but they're not functioning in that capacity independently. They are part of my unit. So if you had your son and his wife and their children functioning completely independently in that unit, that is not an annex. So it has to be used, and the main words in the condition are that it's ancillary to the main use of the dwelling house. So legally there is a distinction, and your condition is saying it has to be used in an ancillary manner. So that's the enforceability point, and it's quite a difficult legal concept, to be honest.
So can you just clarify, could I do that in my garden for my grandchildren?
If it's ancillary to your use and you come get a planning application in, yes.
Yeah. And they could live there.
Right.
They could actually live there.
I think just a clarification for that, if it were ancillary, it wouldn't have a separate address. It wouldn't be 14B or anything like that. It wouldn't have separate utility bills. It would, that's how to think of it. It would look to the main dwelling to be, the address and the bills and all those other things.
Heights, the size of this building?
Well, we've just dealt with that because as it is to the boundary, it wouldn't come under permitted development. No. And that's why they're applying for it, because it is because it has accommodation internally and it is as close to the boundary as it is.
Yeah, so it's not permitted.
No.
And at the back of the house, there's like a woods, isn't there? It's like a woods that you say people you can't get through. I know you've probably had trouble, but if somebody wants to get through to get to the railway station, there would be a path through, and they can get to the railway station out the back. There's no woods I've ever come across that people won't get through if they want to get through. So that could be let as a house separately.
We're being asked to look at it as an annex to the house, so not as a separate dwelling.
May I?
Yes.
I've just had a word with our legal advisor, and recommendation is primarily in relation to the kitchen. If the kitchen wasn't in there, then the family would clearly either be eating cold meals or they'd be going to the house to have their meals with the family. So you could attach a condition, if you were looking at approval, saying notwithstanding plan number 2017-04, no kitchen shall be installed in this building.
interesting.
I must admit, this is something that I've been thinking of doing myself. I've got a garden office at the moment, which is a reasonable size, but it is purely an office. It hasn't got a separate loo, it hasn't got a kitchen, and hasn't got any bedrooms. So what we're looking at here is a principle, and it's sometimes quite exciting on planning that we can look at this, and it's not just this application, but as the two speakers have said, it's the precedent that this will create. Now, my thought was that I wanted it for a granny annex. I've got a mother-in-law in Birmingham who's now getting to the point where she can't manage it, and so she can either live in the main house or get a little bit of independence at the bottom of the garden. Now, is that a good thing? As far as I'm concerned, it gives her a chance of having some independence, but we're there to look over her. Does it save the state having to get involved? Because she's up in Birmingham on her own. We're all down south now. None of us are left in Birmingham to help her out. So, are we doing overall a good thing? So, when we're looking at this, are we going to do a good thing? On the other hand, we know that we can't really enforce it one way or t'other, and there is the potential for abuse, that somebody could actually let it out to a completely independent third party, and we'd be none the wiser. And we know of places in inner London in particular where there are sheds in the back of gardens that are let out to people who, and there is no control over them, and there is lots of problems in terms of potential fire risk, etc. So at least if we're looking at this and we're giving approval, we can see what type of development it should be. We can oversee its building and make sure that it's in compliance with what it should be. So to my mind, rather than a reckless abandonment of control, this would be as applying control. So go back to the principle, do we want this to be possible within Welwyn Hatfield? Now, for my personal circumstances, I'm being selfish here, I'm saying, yes, I would. Would the chances of long-term abuse be detrimental to the borough as against any short-term good that might be achieved? I don't know. People is funny, ain't they? They can always take advantage. But given that officers must have looked at this in quite some detail, and they're not naive, they're aware, just as we are, of potential abuse, though putting in a planning obligation that we know we're not really going to be able to follow up is a little bit disingenuous, I think, is the word. But the speakers are the realists, they understand, but the officers, I think, have looked at this in great detail as an application, and they are satisfied that it is for the purpose for which the applicant is saying, and therefore on this, and despite the fact of potentially creating precedents, I don't think the precedents are necessarily bad, and therefore I will support the officer recommendation.
We did hear from the officers that no family reason has been put forward for this. We've also heard from our legal expert that ancillary to the main house does not mean family. It could be anybody if it is ancillary to the main house. And I'll ask the officers a question. If in 6 months, so if we pass this in 6 months' time, the owner of the house came back to turn it into an HMO, yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. That would be a possibility, wouldn't it? I mean, they'd have to have permission for it, but because it's ancillary to the house, that HMO use could be part of that.
Whilst with any application, if you're approving it, you're approving what is in front of you. What may happen in the future, you'd have to consider as to what is going to happen in the future. It could be taking the roadside, all of those might be HMOs rather than residential dwellings. So you have to consider what is there now. In terms of enforceability, we have many sites across the borough with annexes where we have this type of condition, and it can be enforced. In relation to gypsy and traveller sites, you often have the conditions there relating to the caravans being for family members as well. It is enforceable. In terms of actually being aware of it, invariably it is the neighbours who tell us because they spot something strange going on. And clearly from the photos from Mrs. Allgood, there is quite, from the first floor, you can see across. So I think it needs to be assessed as ancillary accommodation, trusting that that is what the applicant wants. If they do wish to change it, then we'd have to consider that at that time, and then we'd be looking at amenity space, we'd be looking at additional parking, etc., as we would with any other application.
Okay.
I have a question and then a couple of observations. The map that we were given on page 114 appears to show the curtilage of the property going beyond the fence line of the back of the house, where this annex is, I believe, illustrated on this document. The diagrams that we've seen on the screen suggest that there is no fence line in the position on the map in front of us. And it suggests that there's an access route through a back alley or something to one side. Could you just confirm exactly what the situation is with rear access to these properties? I mean, I'm assuming there isn't any other than that gate that you say can't be opened. But where is the fence line and what exactly is the situation in terms of where this property is? Because if that is a back alley, then it may be land that is restricted in terms of what can be built on it by the property owner, i.e. right of access across their land. So can we just confirm what the situation is, please, okay, as a first step, and then I have an observation I'd like.
If you look at the photo in front of you on the screen, you can see the fence line with a gate, and that is the back of their property with a gate into their property. That is what you are asking, is that a back alley? You can see it's very overgrown, it isn't an alley. I know how it appears on the plan, but as you know, often plans in terms of their colours often look different to reality. The officer has been there because I specifically said, can you treble check? So she went out today to check. That is how it appears, and there is no alley round the back.
So that fence line, just to confirm absolutely, that fence line is the red line on this map. Right, okay, that's fine. That answers that question. The observation that I wanted to make is that I found it a bit strange that we're talking about the kitchen as being something that's an ancillary, that would differentiate between potentially ancillary and non-ancillary construction, because I've been to bedsits and stuff where, you know, the sole cooking facility is a microwave, which is clearly quite portable, and you can kind of put it everywhere. In terms of something that I would consider a separate dwelling, a fully featured bathroom might be more appropriate in terms of it being distinguishing between something that could be used in an ancillary use and not an ancillary use. But I think that, for me, the key issue is actually two things in terms of enforcement. If this was to be let as a separate property, then you have to assume that the people who are trying to let that property would in some way attempt to attract tenants, which would mean advertisements, which would be a direct flag to an inappropriate use or unlawful use of an annex to a dwelling that could be enforced against. And there is a particular issue in my own division with a supposed hotel that is not a hotel, where enforcement is actually ongoing on that basis. And the second aspect is, if you were a tenant renting a property, one of the things that you might not unreasonably expect is a separate electricity meter, gas meter and other facility meters. And those are clearly not intended to be there in an annex because it's ancillary to the household, and the household is the structure that would be paying for services. So I think there's a question mark in my mind as to why we don't just say to officers, look, you're going to be inspecting under building regulations the development of this particular site, then can we just confirm that there are no separate services intended or planned to this particular building? And I think that describes quite clearly what is ancillary and what is separate use of a structure. And I think given that we are being told it's ancillary, that is what's been planned, that's the permission that we might, if committee so agrees, apply to this. If there is subsequent evidence that services have been split in that way, there is evidence that this is being used as a separate dwelling, and then enforcement can follow. So I feel quite comfortable about what we're being asked to approve here.
For services there or not?
We will know that at the time of building regulations because the drainage, for example, water connections will have to be made and electrical connections, and whether they run from the meters in the house or separately. However, it's not beyond the wit of...
You said you could eliminate the kitchen.
Yes, please.
Sorry.
When you look at enforcement cases on these type of annexes, and they come up very regularly, you look at what evidence do you need to show whether something is ancillary to the main house or whether something is completely independent. So you're completely correct. If you have separate services, a separate postal address, separate water, separate electricity, that's all indicative that it's not ancillary. But the kitchen is, so often you'll say, well, can this be ancillary? Now, having a bathroom, it's not unreasonable to expect if you've got a bedroom that someone has a bathroom. You wouldn't want them running up and down the garden, having to, use the facilities.
Can I clarify there? What I'm seeing on there is a bathroom with a bath and a shower and a sink and a toilet. I don't think that a toilet and sink is unreasonable, but a bath.
That's debatable, but a bathroom isn't something that you would necessarily say is indicative of a unit being independent. A kitchen, however, in lots of enforcement cases, and I've done quite a lot of them, a kitchen means that you can function independently. And there is an argument to say, well, if it is ancillary, so it is your grandmother and you are taking care of her and she's not living independently, because that's not what is intended. That person shouldn't be living independently. It's ancillary to your own use. So maybe, yes, they can make a cup of tea in the morning and a bit of toast, but they shouldn't be functioning completely independently in that unit. And so that's why a kitchen is often seen as the marker as to what distinguishes something from being ancillary to being independent. And it's a good suggestion to say, well, then we don't allow a kitchen in here. And if you were then enforcing, and you have your condition which says this should be an ancillary use, if you have all those aspects that you described in terms of independent services, kitchen, then it's much more likely that that is an independent use, and you would be demonstrating that factually on an enforcement appeal.
I've worked in several mechanical workshops where they've been in the garden, and they have, although it's been in their garden, their workshop, but they've had a separate electric supply and meter to put against the tax. The other point being an annex, you've got hospitals with annex that are miles away. So this word annex is quite a loose word. Paul's already gone about where the red line covers, because number 12 has done the self same thing. So all these other houses, their boundaries a bit short. But this, again, going back into workshops, they do have toilets and washrooms and showers to wash themselves down at the end of a working day. But I still think about this beds in sheds. It'd be cheaper for them to put a mobile home in the back garden. But services, they don't need to dig a damn great trench to bury the services. But the other point, with all these other cases that have come to, before us, is the thing about overlooking. Yeah, now, these people that in there, they might kick up a stink, they're being overlooked. So if, you know, other people are objecting to being overlooked, these will. So, again, we've got rules and regulations one way, and we've got common sense in another. So, I've got to say, for the...
Rules and regulations, please.
Rules and regulations. And common sense in using them. Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to think, yeah, it's ideal for a family. The other thing is granny annex. You want them fairly close to keep your eye on them.
That's right. No, the garden.
As I say, it's miles away. You know, because if they fall over in the bath, unless they've got a good enough alarm, it take your ages. You want it within...
We've been round this before.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a family member.
No.
It's ancillary to the use of the house.
This is it. We're going back to the sheds in it, because if they do let it, they'll be subject to tax. So, for the good of the people round there, I've got to go against officers, but I'm lost for a planning reason.
Okay, Reg, right. I've got a couple of issues with it. First of all, no kitchen, also no dining room, I think. But also the light, the skylights. Now, I basically worked in something like this at one point, and when it was in use in like a winter evening, the light coming out of it genuinely did upset the neighbours. You know, there was an awful... If someone's living in it, you know, I'm not saying there would be, and we know, you know, incidental use, whatever you call it, but the reality is, I can see it being disturbing. You know, when you look at the view that were on the photos, you've got this bright light coming up. It just... well, that was it. That's all I had to say.
Thank you. Just picking up on your point about the kitchen. So is that you're saying that's a condition we can apply to say you cannot have a kitchen there? When you were talking about advertising potential, you know, facilities, and I immediately thought of Airbnb, and I thought actually that, you know, it's speculative, and obviously we're not allowed to do that, but of course we would see if it was being advertised, and I suppose that's then when enforcement would kick in. I am concerned, though, somebody mentioned building regs or building control going out to inspect to check if there were separate services. I'm not convinced we do that in every situation, so I'm not sure it would be determined. But I mean, I can't see a reason to refuse it, unfortunately, even though I suspect we may be enforcing in the years to come.
Building regs to inspect it, or a licensed inspector, because there will be drainage at least, and connections to main drainage normally are looked at by building inspectors. Right, I think we've talked plenty about this. It is, on the face of it, rather more than an annex because of what's inside it. Looks like a little house. Paul, your point about the services, if people are perfectly above board, they may well do that. If they're not, they'll just say to somebody, it's £500 a week, and you get the electricity and everything into it. And Alan, your bit about them, they'd have to pay tax on the income. Well, no, not really. However, the officers are satisfied with it, and we have had the suggestion that we have a condition to take out the kitchen. Also, just looking at the plan, it would be so easy just to convert that dining room into another bedroom. Yes, yes, that's just. But that wouldn't materially make any difference to it anyway, would it? Okay, so I need someone to propose, please. Steve.
I propose that we simply accept officer's recommendation as is.
With the additional condition?
I don't like the idea of the kitchen going there. Although Grandma doesn't do any cooking, I can't see if there's anything other than window dress.
Okay.
As Paul says, you could easily get a microwave and a portable.
Do I have a...
I think we should refuse officer's recommendation because I think that could be a two-bedroom flat. Sorry. I didn't.
Second Steve's.
Paul, you'll second what Steve says.
I'll second Steve's.
Right. We'll have that as our first proposition then. All those in favour of accepting the officer's recommendation, please show. 6. All those against? Right, so that one is rejected as it stands. May I have another proposal, please?
I propose that we accept officer's recommendation with the additional condition that there should be no kitchen.
Can we can put that in as a condition?
Yep.
Right. Yeah. Okay. May I have a seconder for that?
I think it's got to be without the kitchen and without the dining room.
No. Without the kitchen.
It's not one bedroom, it'll be 2 bedrooms.
Right. Thank you. Right. So we have a seconder for that as well. So the latest proposal is that we accept the officer's recommendation, but with the removal of the kitchen. Sorry, removal of the kitchen. All those in favour of that, please show. Eight. All those against? 6. So that is carried. Okay, we might get home tonight, actually. Right. Sorry? Jill Weston, second. Yeah. Right, next item in number 11, the appeal decisions. You will see, sadly, that we lost 3. But then they were delegated, they didn't come to the committee. Proper look, right. Future planning applications, some of those have been on there a while. Thunderbridge Yards in your...
I was going to say, actually, is there an update to when that might actually come to committee?
Probably not until the district plan is a bit more
advanced.
advanced.
Yeah, I think that was the guidance 6 months. 6 months or so.
And 51 Row Green has been on a little while as well.
Is likely to come.
That's been on there a while now, hasn't it? Not at the moment, we don't know. Well, not tonight, I think, but I can contact you after.
Any other comments on this? No? Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Can I just make an announcement?
Yeah.
Can I just make an announcement? Mark presented the Plot 6000 earlier. I don't know how many of you are aware, but Andrew Mangum left last month, the authority. He's gone back to live permanently up north, and Mark has been successfully promoted into his post.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh, sorry. Calm down.
Anson Court.
Yep.
This signage. We're getting massive problems over this now. Can I call that in